welcome to The Debate. Good morning and welcome to the Friday Debate. This broadcast is sponsored by ProWave AI and is generated by Stylo News, the AI-powered news application.
Right, and for context, Stylo News is the consumer version of Stylo Intel Ops software, which was originally designed for, enterprise operations across government, military, and business sectors.
Exactly. Listeners, you are getting unique access to a tool designed to support global decision-makers in tracking the primary patterns of events of global importance.
Yes.
So, to calmly establish the facts and set the stage today, it is May 1st, 2026. Oil has breached $100 a barrel, a major Gulf ally has just abandoned OPEC, and the Strait of Hormuz is, it's essentially a minefield.
It is a highly volatile reality. Following the United States and Israel's Operation Epic Fury, which resulted in the death of Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, we are observing an ongoing, high-intensity conflict.
Yes, and the United States has instituted a naval blockade of Iranian ports in the Strait of Hormuz. In retaliation, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, has seized commercial vessels, notably the Epaminondas and the MSC Francesca, and has explicitly threatened U.S. warships.
Which brings us to the framing of today's discussion. The central strategic questions are these. Should Iran be allowed to continue its pathway to nuclear arms and its support for proxy wars against Israel?
Or, conversely, should the U.S. and Israel continue military operations to compel Iran to stop these activities? And will this actually foster peace in Gaza and Lebanon?
Right. And finally, how should the Middle East and the European Union support this effort? Through military coalitions or diplomatic mediation?
I will argue that sustained military pressure, including the naval blockade, is the only reliable method left to dismantle Iran's nuclear ambitions and regional proxies.
And I will argue that this military escalation is fundamentally backfiring, actively accelerating Iran's nuclear timeline, and, severely destabilizing the global economy in ways we simply cannot sustain.
Well, to begin, we have to look at the stark, objective reality of the last decade. Diplomatic appeasement has failed.
Has it, though?
It has. Operation Epic Fury and the subsequent military posture are a necessary strategic reality. We are looking at highly effective operations that have severely degraded Iran's air defenses and their conventional navy.
Right, the conventional forces.
Exactly. And in southern Lebanon, Israel's success is quantifiable. They have dismantled over 1,000 Hezbollah terror infrastructure sites, including those massive underground tunnel networks. The stakes here are existential, not just for the Middle East, but globally.
Yes, but the global risk is exactly what...
Well, let me just add, Warren Buffett recently issued a very public warning about the catastrophic global risk of an unstable actor like Iran obtaining nuclear weapons, comparing it unfavorably to the Cold War dynamic. Domestic U.S. sources, from Town Hall to the Jerusalem Post, emphasize that the blockade is a required tool. We have to economically compel the IRGC to halt its support for proxies. We cannot negotiate with a regime that holds global markets hostage.
The tactical victories of Epic Fury are certainly visible, I'll grant you that. But we are assuming that degrading conventional capabilities automatically equates to fostering peace or compliance.
I think it limits their options.
The evidence on the ground suggests it's doing the exact opposite. Military operations are not bringing stability. They are driving Iran closer to the nuclear threshold and emboldening their most hardline elements. Look at what actually happened post-Shakami.
They decentralized.
Exactly. The regime did not collapse. The IRGC consolidated power, utilizing a decentralized mosaic defense strategy that allowed them to absorb the strikes and survive. More alarmingly, U.S. aggression is actively incentivizing Iran to withdraw from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty.
You're referring to the North Korean strategy.
I am. They are looking directly at the North Korean deterrent strategy, which antiwar.com and others have highlighted. Furthermore, this blockade has fractured our global alliances and triggered a severe economic crisis. The tactical victories you mentioned are blinding us to a massive strategic failure, and, frankly, a diplomatic ceasefire is the only viable path back to regional stability.
I have to admit, I struggle to separate the tactical successes from the strategic leverage they create. When the U.S. Secretary of War Pete Hegseth and General Dan Kane announced that Iran's air defense, missile program, and navy had been severely degraded, they weren't just listing destroyed hardware.
No, they were claiming a shift in power.
Right. They were describing the systematic removal of Iran's ability to project conventional power. The U.S. and Israel have successfully targeted dual-use infrastructure. And for our listeners, when we say dual-use, we mean facilities like commercial ports in Bandar Abbas.
Ports that handle civilian goods.
Yes, ports that have heavy lift cranes that unload consumer goods by day, but by night, those same cranes are used to load ballistic missiles onto proxy vessels. By striking that infrastructure, you remove a nation's conventional deterrent and force them to the negotiating table without preconditions.
But does it force them to negotiate?
The Secretary of State has taken a hardline stance that foreign assistance to Iran will not deter U.S. objectives. Isn't applying maximum pressure the only language the IRGC has historically responded to?
It is the language they respond to, yes, but the response is not surrender, it is evolution. By removing their conventional deterrent, we are practically forcing them to rely on an asymmetric and nuclear one.
Asymmetric, perhaps.
Let's talk about that mosaic defense I mentioned earlier. Think of a hornet's nest. Striking a hornet's nest with a baseball bat doesn't eliminate the hornets, it destroys their central structure and forces them to swarm.
But it removes the nest.
But now the hornets are everywhere. By decentralizing their command down to the provincial level, the IRGC ensured that decapitation strikes wouldn't defeat them. We hit the nest, and now they are swarming. They are utilizing asymmetric tools like the newly acquired Chinese TEO-1B spy satellite.
Which provides intelligence, certainly.
Yes, they are no longer fighting blind. They are using that satellite right now to monitor U.S. bases across Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Bahrain, and have threatened surprise tactics to burn U.S. warships.
But those are asymmetric nuisance tactics, not strategic power projection. A satellite provides intelligence, yes, but fast attack boats and threats of surprise tactics can be countered by superior conventional naval power.
I have to disagree with the characterization of this as a mere nuisance. And the deeper issue is the nuclear catalyst. By proving that we will use overwhelming conventional military force against them to achieve our goals, we are proving to the IRGC that a nuclear arsenal is their absolute only guarantee of regime survival.
The North Korea parallel again.
Let's look at the mechanics of it, because it is exactly what Tehran is studying. In the 1990s and early 2000s, North Korea realized its conventional military could never match the United States. They used the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, as a shield to buy time.
And then they withdrew.
Right. When they felt sufficiently threatened by U.S. posture in 2003, they withdrew from the NPT and built a bomb. Today, the IRGC is watching how cautiously the U.S. treats a nuclear-armed North Korea versus how freely we drop ordnance on a non-nuclear Iran. We are essentially writing the instruction manual for them to withdraw from the NPT.
That is a chilling parallel, I'll grant you, but let's look at the actual lesson of North Korea. The lesson isn't that military pressure creates nuclear states.
What is it then?
The lesson is that if you allow a rogue state the time and economic breathing room to develop a nuclear weapon, under the guise of prolonged bad faith diplomatic negotiations, they will eventually cross the threshold.
But diplomacy...
The 1994 U.S.-North Korea framework failed precisely because it didn't pair diplomacy with sufficient crippling enforcement. We cannot afford to make that same mistake with Iran. Yes, striking the nest causes a swarm in the short term. But if you don't strike it, you surrender the house.
At what cost to the global economy, though?
The blockade is designed to starve their resources so they cannot afford to run those centrifuges or fund those proxies.
But we have to ask, are we starving their resources or are we starving the global economy? Let's pivot slightly to the immediate reality our listeners are facing at the gas pump and in the supply chain.
The economic fallout.
Exactly. The immediate consequences of this naval blockade are hitting the international community far harder than they are breaking the IRGC. The IRGC has retaliated by closing the Strait of Hormuz to hostile nations and implementing a devastating retaliation formula.
The 1-for-4 threat?
Yes, they have explicitly threatened that for every one Iranian oil well struck, they will target 4 allied oil wells in the Gulf.
Which is exactly why the blockade is necessary. to cut off their resources and intercept their vessels before they can execute such threats on a mass scale.
But the economic earthquake is already happening today. The blockade has sent oil surging past $100 a barrel. We are seeing a critical aviation fuel shortage in Europe, to the point where organizations like ACI Europe are warning of systemic flight cancellations.
The markets are certainly reacting.
And just look at the breaking news today, May 1st. The United Arab Emirates has officially exited OPEC. We need to unpack why that matters. OPEC isn't just a club. It relies on the spare production capacity of nations like the UAE and Saudi Arabia to act as global shock absorbers.
To pump more oil during a crisis.
Exactly. If there's a crisis, they pump more oil to keep prices stable. By exiting, the UAE is stating that the organization fundamentally failed to protect member interests amid this maritime chaos. When one of the wealthiest Gulf nations removes that safety net to protect its own market share, that shatters market predictability.
It does create anxiety.
Social media sentiment globally reflects deep, palpable anxiety over inflation and fuel shortages. The blockade isn't just isolating Iran, it's isolating the U.S. and destabilizing the world economy.
Well, for our listeners who are seeing gas prices spike in their own neighborhoods right now, it is completely understandable to look at this disruption and feel like the blockade is a failure. But we have to look under the hood at what those prices are actually buying us in terms of global security.
Buying us security or buying us a wider war?
Is short-term economic pain not a necessary cost to prevent a permanent existential nuclear threat? Yes, oil at $100 a barrel is painful, but Warren Buffett's warning was not hyperbole. The economic fallout of a nuclear detonation, or even the geopolitical extortion that a nuclear-armed Iran could wield over global markets indefinitely, would dwarf the current inflation metrics.
I don't disagree with the danger of a nuclear Iran, but...
And furthermore, the U.S. is not acting recklessly in the maritime space. The administration is actively building a multinational maritime coalition involving commercial shipping and insurance sectors to demine the Strait of Hormuz and restore freedom of navigation.
That is a massive undertaking.
It is. We intercepted the Epaminondas and the MSC Francesca because Iran was using them for unauthorized navigation to evade sanctions. The U.S. Navy is performing mine-clearing operations right now to ensure global commerce can safely resume.
I wish it were that clean, but a demining operation in the Strait of Hormuz right now is essentially a daily, high-stakes game of chicken in one of the most vital geographic choke points on Earth. You mentioned the Epaminondas. Iran detained it because the ship had made 36 stops at U.S. ports between 2024 and 2026.
They suspected it of carrying military logistics?
Right. They suspected U.S. military logistical ties. And when we talk about U.S. naval superiority countering asymmetric threats, we have to talk about the Mosquito fleet. Iran's fast attack boats aren't meant to win a naval battle.
They're a swarm tactic.
They are like a cloud of gnats flying into a jet engine. Individually, a gnat is nothing, but thousands of them armed with anti-ship missiles can stall a multi-billion-dollar carrier strike group. That is why the U.S. Navy is struggling to operate effectively in the Strait right now.
It is a contested environment, certainly.
We even lost an F-15E fighter jet and an A-10 Warthog in this theater. These are significant losses, proving their degraded air defenses are still highly lethal.
The loss of aircraft is undeniably tragic, but it is a known risk in high-intensity conflict. You cannot measure strategic success solely by the absence of short-term friction.
But is the strategy working?
The fact that the IRGC is resorting to hijacking commercial vessels and taking sailors hostage proves that the blockade is working. It is suffocating them and they are lashing out. But let's look at the broader alliance, because the U.S. is not doing this alone.
The alliances are showing cracks, though.
The Middle East and the EU are recognizing the necessity of military support. The Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC, is actively unifying right now to address the security challenges from Iranian proxies. We are seeing U.S. Patriot missiles being actively deployed to defend Gulf states against Iranian drone attacks.
Deployed at the expense of others, I might add.
And in Europe, nations led by the UK and France are organizing maritime security missions to protect commercial shipping. They recognize that military force is required to keep the strait open.
Well, if we look closely at the intelligence reports and diplomatic cables, they tell a story of severe friction within that very alliance. The UK and France are organizing a maritime mission, yes, but they explicitly stated it is a peaceful and defensive mission that will only commence after regional military conflicts cease.
They are taking a cautious posture.
They are carefully avoiding joining a U.S. strike force. In fact, the UK's security advisor, Lord Peter Ricketts, has publicly called the U.S. an unreliable partner in the wake of this conflict. That is an astonishing statement from our closest historical ally.
Friction in alliances during wartime is historically normal. The logistical realities of coordinating multiple militaries always generate diplomatic tension.
But it's not just logistical friction, it is a fundamental divergence in strategy. The EU is deeply frustrated, and we have to explain why. A Patriot missile battery takes years to manufacture.
Yes, they are complex systems.
Right now, arms deliveries to Europe, specifically to the Baltic and Scandinavian regions, are facing massive delays because U.S. stockpiles are being depleted by the Iran conflict and diverted to the Gulf to protect Saudi and Emirati airspace. Europe is terrified because they feel their security architecture is being sacrificed for a war of choice in the Middle East, leaving them vulnerable to Russia.
I hear that concern, I do. But if Iran achieves nuclear parity, the conventional drone strikes the Gulf currently suffers will become nuclear extortion. The administration is operating under the strategic calculation that a nuclear-armed Iran is the ultimate unacceptable outcome, prioritizing it even above European stockpile comfort.
But the region itself doesn't seem to agree with that military prioritization. Regional players are actively rejecting the escalation route. Pakistan and Saudi Arabia just hosted high-level talks at the Nur Khan Air Base in Rawalpindi.
Yes, I saw those reports.
And China is actively pushing for diplomatic mediation, leveraging its massive economic ties with Tehran. If you look at regional sentiment, as reported by outlets like Al Jazeera, the overwhelming consensus favors an immediate diplomatic ceasefire, not military integration.
We have to look at what those diplomatic channels actually yield. Iran rejected the latest ceasefire proposals because they demanded U.S. military withdrawal from the Middle East and $500 billion in reparations.
Those are opening bids in a negotiation.
Those are not the demands of a nation engaging in good faith diplomacy. Those are the demands of a regime trying to buy time to enrich uranium. And regarding the mediation you mentioned, it is highly notable that Pakistan's defense minister sent out a controversial tweet criticizing Israel right before the talks at the Nur Khan Air Base, severely straining Pakistan's claim to neutrality.
It certainly complicated things.
As for China's mediation, China is the same actor that just supplied Iran with that TTO-1B spy satellite to track American troops. Their version of diplomacy is providing asymmetric military advantages to our adversary. Ignoring Iran's march toward regional hegemony out of fear that it might upset global supply chains or push them closer to Beijing is the very definition of appeasement.
That actually perfectly illustrates my final point. By pushing Iran into a corner with an uncompromising military blockade, we have forced them directly into the arms of Russia in China.
They were already heading there.
But this isn't just about Iran anymore. It is about the broader geopolitical alignment. We are accelerating the very multipolar resistance we fear. When the U.S. insists on military operations, Iran responds by sharing satellite intelligence and battlefield expertise with Russia, which Russia then uses against Ukraine.
It is all interconnected.
Exactly. The interconnectivity of these conflicts means you cannot view Operation Epic Fury in a vacuum. Every time we strike Tehran, the swarm disrupts global shipping, depletes European air defenses, and strengthens the Sino-Russian strategic partnership. If the blockade is economically crippling us, fracturing our alliances, failing to trigger internal regime change, and pushing Iran toward the nuclear threshold, how long do we sustain this before admitting the strategy requires adjustment?
We sustain it until the strategic objective is met. The irreversible dismantling of their nuclear program and their proxy networks. The Middle East will only find peace when the chief exporter of instability is neutralized.
It's a high-stakes gamble.
It is exactly this complex reality that makes these discussions so vital. Today, we have examined the tactical military outcomes of Operation Epic Fury, the cascading economic impacts on global oil and alliances, and the profound strategic questions of nuclear deterrence.
Yes, we have.
To summarize my position, I have argued that sustained military operations, and strict naval blockades are the only proven, reliable methods left to halt Iran's pathway to a nuclear weapon and dismantle the regional proxy networks threatening Israel and global commerce. The degradation of their conventional forces, despite the short-term economic friction, is a necessary step for long-term global security.
And to summarize my position, I have argued that these very military actions are fundamentally counterproductive. The evidence suggests they are accelerating Iran's nuclear ambitions by validating their need for a deterrent, while simultaneously fracturing Western alliances, depleting crucial defense stockpiles, and causing severe, unsustainable economic destabilization worldwide.
The situation in the Middle East remains incredibly fluid. There is continued profound disagreement over whether a military coalition or diplomatic mediation will ultimately secure the Strait of Hormuz and bring lasting peace to Gaza and Lebanon.
We certainly won't solve it entirely today.
No, we will not declare a definitive winner today, because the facts present a constantly evolving, highly complex geopolitical puzzle that global decision-makers are actively struggling to solve. There is certainly more to explore in the material as these events unfold.
Absolutely.
We want to remind our audience that this broadcast is brought to you by Stylo News. Stylo News is available as a mobile and computer app that you can download and customize for personal, intelligence-style briefs drawn from hundreds of traditional news sources and X, formerly Twitter.
Right. We invite you to subscribe to get AI-powered news on demand by visiting www.stylonews.com.
Good day to you all. And that concludes the Friday debate. We leave you with this thought to consider. When navigating the razor's edge of global security, is a greater risk found in striking an adversary and managing the fallout, or in stepping back and hoping they never cross the ultimate threshold?